I'm fed up. Enough with all the lies. The latest from Western propaganda is that Donald Trump was practically yelling at Volodymyr Zelensky, trying to get this supposed agreement, under which the Russian Federation would be giving up territories, and not just any territories, but two absolutely key territories. They explicitly mention Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, and this is where my blood basically boils, because they have no idea. I'm going to specifically use these two regions to, on one hand, show you how Western propagandists constantly lie, and on the other hand, explain why the Russian Federation will never give them up, which, by the way, is an absolutely key point when it comes to understanding not only the Ukrainian conflict, but also its possible, and hopefully very near ending. They speak without having any idea, so we're here to fight their lies with real knowledge. I've worked as a war correspondent in Donbass for 3 years, almost since the special military operation began. And I'll go even further. In this informative work, I'm going to be extremely brief and concise, because here are the 10 reasons why the Russian Federation will never give up the regions of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. Stay until the end, because that's where the most important reasons are, the key points of this whole conflict. Let's start, as usual, from the beginning. According to several Western media outlets, among which we can explicitly mention the Washington Post, or, for example, the Financial Times, this particular article is quite something. And how so? Well, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin have practically agreed on the end of the conflict. And in this formula, the Russian Federation would be willing to give up several territories to Ukraine in exchange for really just one, which is the Donetsk People's Republic, or what's left of Donetsk, under Ukrainian control. However, the key here lies in two regions, particularly Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, which, according to these sources, the Russian Federation, I repeat, would be willing to give up. And I'll go further. The headlines speak in absolutely catastrophic terms. Donald Trump was almost shouting at Volodymyr Zelensky, telling him to either accept Putin's conditions, yes, to give up territories now controlled by the Russian Federation, Putin, or the Russian Federation, or else they will destroy him. Indeed, this information, which came from the main Western media, was also gladly picked up by some of the smaller outlets, including local ones, for example. So, La Razón talked about the same thing, but in somewhat paraphrased terms. The articles in question have quite a lot to unpack. One of the most interesting ones, without a doubt, belongs to the Financial Times, which was in the edition between the 19th and 20th. Yes, after actually being published no less than 45 times. Yes, the article was edited not once or twice, but, I repeat, 45 times. You'd already know this if you were in my private Telegram group, where our exclusive community discusses topics like this. But above all, in-depth investigations, such as, for example, what's happening now between the United States, Venezuela, and now also Colombia. How does the European Union confront the Russian Federation through regulations? And what kind of new weapons updates has the Russian Federation released recently? I'm not going to tell you anything else. I'll leave the link in a pinned comment. We'll be waiting for you there, because this project is just getting started. But it does so with unparalleled strength. That's Western ingenuity in all its glory. They edited it 45 times and still got none right, because the truth is that what they wrote in the article has already been denied by both the United States and Moscow. On one hand, Donald Trump said that he wasn't talking about any kind of territorial concessions by the Russian Federation, but rather about freezing the conflict, meaning ending it exactly under the current conditions, simply freezing, I repeat, the current front line and signing, and then peace, supposedly definitive. On the other hand, recently, Peskov also spoke, that is, directly from the Kremlin, and he said that the objectives for the Russian Federation remained exactly the same, implying that Russia is by no means willing to give up any of the 4 regions, that is, neither the Lugansk People's Republic nor the Donetsk People's Republic, and much less Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. Regarding whether or not to cede territories, generally speaking, by the Russian Federation, we talked about it in yesterday's live stream, and there we focused especially on the military situation, because it is indeed quite important here. However, today we are going to talk, on the one hand, in more general terms, because the reasons are very diverse and not only cover the military aspect. On the other hand, more specifically, we will mention the regions of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, especially to highlight this absolute lie from the media mercenaries. And this, in fact, is another key point of this video. Not only to better understand the Ukrainian conflict, we are here today, but also to show that in the vast majority of cases, which really annoys and frustrates me, unfortunately, when it comes to this same Ukrainian conflict, the people who talk to us are so-called armchair experts. I mean, they've never even set foot on the battlefield, much less are they real experts. Just couch or armchair experts, whichever you prefer, who pontificate about territories they've never set foot in, much less during an open war like the current one. They haven't been on the battlefield, or in Kherson or Zaporizhzhia, in the vast majority of cases, not even in Russia or Ukraine. And going even further, I would say that they haven't even stopped to look closely at the maps of either country. And of course, that's how it happens. How do these flashy headlines come to light that really have nothing to do with reality? Is it because the people who write them have absolutely no idea what they're talking about? And I'll tell you more. They don't analyze, they speculate. And yes, I imagine you've already figured that out. Today we're here for exactly the opposite reason, to analyze and to speak, once again, with real knowledge. Today, it's not so much the geopolitical analyst speaking, but rather the war correspondent in Donbass, the person who has traveled through all 4 regions. That's first of all. And secondly, someone who has been in very close contact with soldiers who are actually the ones who manage to control those territories. On one hand, those who will have to defend them, and not only that, I will also share information gathered from sources here who will later have to carry out the reconstruction and assimilation of those territories by the Russian Federation. I will use all of this to explain to you in detail, in exactly 10 points, why the Russian Federation will never give up the regions of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. Point number 1, perhaps the most basic. All of this should be understandable for everyone. But as we can see, for some reason, that's not the case. The regions of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, as well as the People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, became part of the Russian Federation in September 2022. To that end, a referendum was even held. Yes, a referendum during wartime. So, did they really have to go through so much trouble to establish this territory as an inalienable part of the Russian Federation? And this needs to be underlined twice. Another point that needs to be specifically highlighted here is that Vladimir Putin, among many other things, is a lawyer. In fact, a very good one. So everything he does, he tries to do as closely as possible to the law. I mean, they could simply take the regions in question and not include them in the constitution of the Russian Federation. But the truth is, they're there. So we're talking not only about a possible loss of reputation, but directly about violating the most important law in the country, which no president should allow themselves. But I'm telling you, Vladimir Putin definitely won't. Point number 2, I just mentioned it in passing, the reputational crisis that could arise as a result of handing over those territories, which, I repeat, are already part of the constitution of the Russian Federation, as territory of that country. And here we should talk about a reputational blow with 2 sides. On one hand, internally, meaning in terms of domestic politics, and on the other hand, of course, externally, that is, everything related to foreign policy, and above all, to the partners of the Russian Federation. Yes, I can now imagine a lot of surprise on more than one person's face, because supposedly Russia is a terrible dictatorship where the people simply have no say and can't express any opinions at all. They don't even have the possibility or the right, of course, to do so. But the truth is that this isn't true. And in fact, during the special military operation, Russian society has really come together around the cause, specifically to defeat a common enemy that they don't see in Ukraine, but rather in the West. And now, imagine that all these people, already united by the war, and currently supporting the government quite actively, suddenly turn against it. And yes, it can definitely happen, because the cost is no surprise to anyone, of carrying out the special military operation and defending, among other things, and almost primarily, the sovereignty of the Russian Federation. At the international level, it has indeed been, and continues to be, very high. I mean, having lost so many resources, especially in terms of human lives, just to actually gain control of these two regions. So now what? Just hand them over to the West, in exchange for what exactly? From Donetsk region? Very important, of course. Maybe one of the most important, but just as important as the other two, which I repeat, are part of the most important law of the Russian Federation. Also, of course, it would represent a very serious problem if it were not fulfilled. And the thing is, if Russia tries to project anything internationally, it's above all that it pays its debts, that it acts under strict legality, in other words, with the law in hand, and that it keeps its word. And this kind of game that's being played, for some reason, by today's Western media, one day with me, the next day without me. This is happening not only with the territories of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, but also with the civilians in both regions. Of course, it immediately rules out all three assumptions. We discussed the third point in great detail during yesterday's live stream, but today, without a doubt, we have to mention it again, and that's the situation at the front. Here are two things to highlight in particular. First of all, right now the initiative is completely on the side of the Russian Federation, which is advancing in almost all directions on the front. And could we say that victory is really just a matter of time? How much time? We don't know, but what is certain is that it will definitely come. Second point, which we already mentioned briefly in the previous points, is the price that has been paid. Here we're speaking directly in military terms, yes, especially in terms of soldiers who are citizens of the Russian Federation. It has been terribly high. Of course, nothing compared to the Ukrainian losses, but nothing that would allow Russia to give up those two regions that have been so hard to liberate. Point number 4. The geographical situation of both Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. All of this is quite related to the previous point, that is, to the military situation. And if we're talking about the Russian Federation really wanting to achieve a lasting and definitive peace, what it needs, among other things, is to prepare defensive lines that can actually guarantee it. That is, Donald Trump's proposal to freeze the Frontline exactly as it is sounds wonderfully good, especially if what you want is to end the war right now. But it's not a realistic proposal, nor is it truly a commitment to lasting peace. What's more, leaving the Frontline exactly as it is now, which in many cases is literally just open fields with a few defensive positions, it almost certainly means returning to this same conflict, not even in a few years, but in just a matter of weeks. We're going to repeat the fate of the so-called peace that was signed between Israel and Hamas. So, the main goal here is to establish coherent defensive lines that, on one hand, prevent future attacks, and, on the other hand, protect the civilian population, which indeed the Russian Federation came to protect in those territories. In military terms, especially in terms of real military personnel, whom I talk to a lot here in Donbass, you can't leave people out in the middle of the field and expect them to do anything to defend their positions. That is, these positions, in order to be defended beforehand, have to be set up logically and coherently. Otherwise, it's impossible for peace to last even a little bit. Lastly, speaking in geographical terms, this is also often mentioned by the Russian military. A natural boundary might be helpful, such as, for example, the Dnieper River. That is, something that would help the Russian Federation, but actually both sides, to establish their respective defensive positions, and to clearly and securely demarcate the territory that, from now on, effectively belongs to them. Point number 5. We could call it something like zero benefit when it comes to handing over the territories in question, namely the regions of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. And considering one of the previous points, That is, the military situation, meaning the way things are progressing today in military terms. On the battlefield, the Russian Federation, more or less in a year, if there is no catastrophic collapse of the Ukrainian defensive lines, which, by the way, is quite likely, but it will end up liberating, as they would say in Russia, the territory of the Donetsk People's Republic, without any kind of exchange being necessary for it. That is, without giving up any of the regions it controls today in exchange. So, what exactly is the point of doing it right now? It's questionable, to say the least. This brings us directly to point 6. The thing is, the benefit for the Russian Federation in keeping these two regions is actually quite the opposite. Huge, abysmal. In this sense, a key point that is practically never, or I would just say never, mentioned by Western media. Of course, when you're not on the ground, it's very hard to know such tiny but crucial details. And these are regions that are practically undamaged. For the most part, they have been preserved just as they were right before the start of the special military operation. I repeat, almost in their entirety. In fact, you can check this for yourselves by watching one of my reports that I did in the city of Berdyansk, which actually belongs to the Zaporizhzhia region. There, I was talking to civilians on one hand, but on the other, I was showing you this city that the armed forces of Ukraine abandoned without firing a single shot. And just like in Berdyansk, the same thing happened in Melitopol and in many other cities in both regions.
Does it still look the same as before the conflict broke out? I will attach footage that I recorded from my car window as I was driving through. And that's because when Western media talk to you about the region,
perhaps one of the areas that has suffered the most from the fighting has been a small part of Kherson, but today, in fact, it doesn't have any civil importance, because due to its proximity to Ukrainian troops, it is already quite controlled by the armed forces of the Russian Federation, with constant entry and exit of drones, of course, as well. So, except for maybe that little piece, the rest of the territory is pure benefit. There's no need for any investment to get everything up and running, since for the most part, there's nothing to rebuild. But also, we're talking about territories that are already making quite a lot of money, and that's how we get to point number 7. And the thing is, when we're talking about Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, we're talking about two very rich regions, especially in extremely fertile land. There is some production, but it's true that the vast majority of the productive sector, for example, in the case of the Zaporizhzhia region, it's located in the capital, in Zaporizhzhia, which today is under Ukrainian control. In the rest of the area controlled by Ukraine and the Russian Federation, the fields are both vast and fertile. Everything grows there. Here, farmers even say that if you plant a stick, it will end up growing anyway, and it will turn, no matter what, into a fruit tree with the tastiest fruits and the most beautiful leaves. But the land, of course, is by no means the only source of income, although it is a very important one. Point number 8. Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. We're not talking about just any dry energy source, but one that, at the time when it was still fully operational, it was providing Ukraine with no less than 25% of all its electricity. For the Russian Federation, therefore, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant represents, on one hand, a source of energy, a clear benefit, but on the other hand, a constant source of risk and Ukrainian provocations everywhere. I myself was at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant doing a report, talking to civilians, who mostly, though, covered their faces. It was perhaps the toughest report I ever did. In human terms, they assured me that the one attacking the nuclear power plant was not, of course, the Russian Federation. Let me translate it for you. It was Ukraine, yes, attacking their population and the energy source that's supposed to matter so much to them. They say that
someone is shelling this station. Is that true? Well, it is being bombed and shelled.
Well, there is some shooting.
Do you know who it is?
Well, it's clear that it's coming from over there.
From where?
From the direction of Nikopol?
That's from Ukraine's side.
Yes.
Is it clear who's working here? Of course.
Yes.
That is, if it remains in Ukrainian hands, anything could happen with this plant. They might suddenly appear and claim the reactors don't work anymore because Russia left it that way, and cause almost, or even literally, a real nuclear catastrophe. I mean, if Russia didn't care about losing the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, for whatever benefit it might bring, it would at least have to consider the security aspect, underlined with two very thick lines: the security of the Russian Federation, and also international security. Point number 9. And here we're already getting closer to the key of this whole issue. The Sea of Azov, which today is the inland sea of the Russian Federation, and if they were to give up the territory of any of the regions, namely Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, or even both, the Russian Federation would end up losing it as such, having to share another sea with Ukraine and face the dangers and disadvantages that come with it. First of all, of course, we must especially mention the dangers. The Black Sea that the Russian Federation shares with Ukraine. Today, it already poses a danger not only to Russia, but also to other countries, such as Romania and Turkey. At certain times, even mines that Ukraine placed in the Black Sea to prevent a possible advance of the Russian fleet ended up there. And yes, when I say placed, I mean poorly, at the wrong time, in an absolutely disorganized way. Because why risk the same thing happening in the sea, Azov? Besides security, of course, we must mention the strategic importance. Right now, it represents one of the most important logistical routes, not just at this moment, but also for the future. Imagine production in Donbass, for example, in the Donetsk People's Republic, which could be transported from there via the Sea of Azov directly to anywhere else, whether it's part of the Russian Federation or directly part of the world. A safe sea and logistical route with significant future commercial potential. Come on, that sounds like total madness. Just take it and hand it over to the West. For what reason? And in case point 9 wasn't enough, we have to finish the picture with point number 10. The regions of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, in addition to everything mentioned before, are themselves a direct land corridor to the Crimean Peninsula. Boom! And here is basically where we've reached the key to this whole issue. The alternative that exists today to reach the Crimean Peninsula from the territory of the Russian Federation is the Kerch Bridge. Yes, that same bridge that has been under so many attacks, I would even say constant attacks, all this time from Ukraine, with, as some rumors say, even help and organization from the West. It's the flagship project of the Russian Federation, an absolutely key point in strategic terms, but also a major source of danger. Nothing to do with this alternative route, represented by the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson corridor. I repeat, in addition to everything mentioned before, and as if that weren't enough, they are logistical regions. It's something like Russian logistics itself. They are two transit regions, and not just to anywhere, but directly to the Atro Peninsula, a key point of the Russian crown. And besides everything I just mentioned, there's another issue that is mentioned very little by Western media. The thing is, the regions of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia could have actually been handed over by the Russian Federation before they were included in its constitution. This, of course, is more like a kind of unconfirmed rumor. But who has talked about this? Among others, it was Arestovich, who, I remind you, was on one hand an advisor to the presidential office, and on the other hand, was part of the 2022 delegation that met with the Russian Federation in Istanbul. Yes, precisely when the Russian Federation was more than willing, as a kind of gesture of goodwill, to withdraw its troops from most of Ukrainian territory, leaving the conflict settled, but importantly, in an absolutely definitive and decisive way. But Ukraine didn't want to. So Arestovich says, Vladimir Putin would have been satisfied with the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic. But time goes by, and the stakes get higher. That is, No one is going to negotiate with Ukraine now, in 2025, on the terms of 2022. And furthermore, here I quote again the Russian delegation that met with the Ukrainian delegation not so many months ago. And they said that where today we are talking about 4 regions, after a reasonable amount of time, it could be 6. And I add on my part, it could even be more. That is, the key question in all of this, to sum it up, in a very brief summary, is not whether Russia will give up the regions of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, but rather, who exactly benefits from Western media doing everything possible to present it as a real possibility? I'm Lucivaya, a geopolitical analyst and war correspondent in Donbass. Subscribe to this channel for the latest geopolitical news from both sides so you'll never be fooled by Western propaganda.